J. Robert Oppenheimer's name is forever tied to one of the most haunting and profound moments in human history. Standing in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, as the first atomic bomb detonated in a blinding explosion, he uttered words that would define not just his legacy, but the dawn of the nuclear age. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This line, borrowed from the Hindu scripture Bhagavad Gita, encapsulated the gravity of what had just been unleashed, a force capable of ending wars, shaping geopolitics, and threatening human existence itself. Oppenheimer, the man who led the scientific effort to create the bomb, found himself at the center of one of history's greatest paradoxes. He was a man of immense intellect and poetic sensibility, yet his greatest achievement was an instrument of unprecedented destruction. He was celebrated as a war hero, yet within years he would be ostracized and stripped of influence. His story is one of ambition, scientific brilliance, ethical turmoil, and political downfall. The detonation of the atomic bomb was not just a technical triumph. It was a moment that forever altered the course of civilization. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended World War II, but at an unimaginable cost. Tens of thousands vaporized instantly, cities reduced to ash, and generations affected by radiation. The world had crossed a threshold into an era where human beings now wielded the power to annihilate themselves. The moral and philosophical implications of nuclear weapons would torment Oppenheimer for the rest of his life. Unlike many of his colleagues who saw the bomb as a necessary evil, he understood the Pandora's box that had been opened. He later lobbied against nuclear proliferation and opposed the hydrogen bomb, a decision that made him a political target in the McCarthy-era paranoia of the 1950s. His once brilliant career was derailed by accusations of communist sympathies, and he was ultimately stripped of his security clearance in a humiliating hearing. Once the face of American scientific achievement, he became an outcast, a fallen genius caught between the very forces he helped unleash. Oppenheimer remains one of the most controversial and complex figures in modern history. To some, he was a tragic visionary, a man who understood too late the consequences of his work. To others, he was an ambitious scientist who disregarded morality in pursuit of knowledge and power. His life and legacy force us to grapple with timeless ethical dilemmas. Should scientific discovery be pursued at any cost? Is it possible to separate knowledge from its consequences? Can a man be both a creator and a destroyer? His story is not just about physics and warfare, but about the very nature of human responsibility in an age of technological advancement. This documentary will explore Oppenheimer's life in depth, from his early brilliance as a physicist to his leadership of the Manhattan Project, the momentous decision to drop the bomb, and his eventual fall from grace. It will delve into the ethical questions he faced, the political forces that shaped his career, and the enduring impact of nuclear weapons on the world. Through archival footage, expert analysis, and reflections from historians and scientists, we will attempt to understand the man behind the myth. Oppenheimer was neither purely a hero nor a villain, but something far more human. A deeply intelligent, deeply flawed individual who stood at the intersection of science, power, and morality. His story is one that continues to resonate in a world where the specter of nuclear conflict still looms. J. Robert Oppenheimer was born on April 22, 1904, in New York City, into a family of immense wealth, privilege, and intellectual refinement. His father, Julius Oppenheimer, was a successful German Jewish textile importer who had arrived in the United States in the late 19th century, embodying the classic immigrant success story. Through hard work and keen business acumen, Julius built a fortune, allowing the family to live comfortably on Manhattan's Upper West Side. His mother, Ella Friedman, was an accomplished artist, known for her refined aesthetic sense and cultural sophistication. The Oppenheimer household was one of intellectual vibrancy, filled with books, art, and discussions of philosophy and literature. Their apartment in Riverside Drive boasted an impressive collection of paintings, including works by Van Gogh and Rembrandt, reflecting the family's deep appreciation for the arts and culture. Raised in such an environment, young Robert was steeped in intellectualism from an early age, absorbing knowledge voraciously and developing a personality that would later be described as both brilliant and enigmatic. Despite growing up in a secular household, Oppenheimer's Jewish heritage played a subtle but important role in shaping his identity. He was raised without strong religious instruction, yet the weight of his ancestry, particularly in an era of growing anti-Semitism, would linger over his personal and professional life. His father's success had allowed the family to integrate into the upper echelons of New York society, but the prejudices of the time ensured that full acceptance was always out of reach. This dynamic made Oppenheimer both an insider and an outsider, a position that he would occupy throughout his life, whether in academia, government circles, or the scientific community. It contributed to the development of his complex personality, at times aloof and arrogant, yet deeply introspective and sensitive to the larger forces shaping the world around him. From an early age, Oppenheimer displayed an extraordinary intellect. He was a precocious child, learning to speak and read at an unusually young age. By the time he was in grade school, he had developed a voracious appetite for knowledge, devouring books on subjects ranging from literature and philosophy to chemistry and physics. His intellectual curiosity extended far beyond the sciences. He was equally captivated by poetry, classical literature, and Eastern philosophy. He had a remarkable facility for languages, eventually becoming proficient in Latin, Greek, German, French, and even Sanskrit, a skill that would later enable him to engage deeply with Hindu texts such as the Bhagavad Gita, which would profoundly influence his philosophical outlook. Oppenheimer attended the Ethical Culture School in New York, an elite institution that emphasized critical thinking, humanism, and intellectual rigor. The school's progressive curriculum fostered a sense of inquiry and encouraged students to pursue knowledge not just for practical purposes, but for the sake of understanding itself. He thrived in this environment, excelling in virtually every subject. His teachers recognized his exceptional talents, and by the time he graduated, he had already begun conducting independent research in chemistry and physics. His high school years were marked by an intense intellectualism that sometimes isolated him from his peers. Though he was not socially withdrawn, his formidable intellect and deep immersion in academic pursuits often set him apart. He had few close friends, preferring the company of books and ideas to casual social interactions. At the age of 18, Oppenheimer enrolled at Harvard University, where he embarked on an academic journey that would cement his reputation as one of the brightest minds of his generation. Harvard's rigorous academic environment provided him with the perfect stage to showcase his intellectual prowess. He pursued an ambitious and wide-ranging course of study, majoring in chemistry but quickly gravitating toward physics, which was emerging as the most exciting and revolutionary field of scientific inquiry in the early 20th century. The discoveries of relativity and quantum mechanics were transforming the landscape of modern science, and Oppenheimer found himself drawn to the profound questions that these new theories posed. His time at Harvard was characterized by an insatiable thirst for knowledge. Unlike most students who focused on a single discipline, Oppenheimer immersed himself in a variety of subjects, including literature, philosophy, and Eastern studies. He developed a deep appreciation for classical and modern literature, writing poetry and engaging in discussions on the works of T.S. Eliot, Shakespeare, and the ancient Greeks. At the same time, he cultivated an interest in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, which would later influence his reflections on science and morality. His fascination with the Bhagavad Gita, in particular, revealed his attraction to existential and ethical dilemmas, a theme that would become increasingly relevant in his later years. Despite his extraordinary academic achievements, Oppenheimer was not without personal struggles. He was known for his intensity and occasional mood swings, displaying traits that suggested deep internal conflicts. He could be charming and eloquent in one moment and withdrawn and irritable in the next. His mind operated at a speed that often left others struggling to keep up, making him appear arrogant or aloof. Yet those who knew him well recognized a certain vulnerability beneath his brilliance, a man who constantly wrestled with the weight of knowledge and the responsibilities that came with it. Upon completing his undergraduate studies in just 3 years, graduating summa cum laude, Oppenheimer sought to further his education in Europe, where the most groundbreaking developments in physics were taking place. He initially went to Cambridge University in England, where he studied under the renowned physicist J.J. Thomson. However, his experience at Cambridge was deeply frustrating. The institution's emphasis on experimental physics did not align with his strengths, which were primarily theoretical. He struggled with laboratory work, finding it tedious and unfulfilling. His frustration led to bouts of depression, and he became increasingly anxious and erratic. There are accounts suggesting that during this period, he suffered a severe psychological crisis, at one point even contemplating poisoning one of his professors out of sheer frustration, a dark and troubling episode that hinted at the depths of his inner turmoil. Realizing that his true talents lay in theoretical physics, Oppenheimer moved to the University of Göttingen in Germany, where he joined the research group of Max Born, one of the leading figures in quantum mechanics. Göttingen was at the epicenter of a scientific revolution, and Oppenheimer found himself surrounded by some of the most brilliant minds of his time. It was here that he truly came into his own as a physicist. Under Born's guidance, he made significant contributions to quantum theory, particularly in the area of molecular wave functions. He absorbed the latest developments in physics with remarkable speed and engaged in discussions with future luminaries such as Werner Heisenberg, Paul Dirac, and Niels Bohr. His intellectual camaraderie with these pioneers deepened his understanding of the profound and often counterintuitive nature of quantum mechanics. During this period, Oppenheimer also developed a distinctive style of thinking that combined rigorous scientific analysis with philosophical reflection. He was not content merely to solve equations. He sought to understand the deeper implications of scientific discoveries, contemplating their philosophical and ethical dimensions. This holistic approach to knowledge distinguished him from many of his contemporaries, making him not just a brilliant physicist but also an intellectual force of considerable depth. His time in Göttingen culminated in a PhD at the age of 23, marking the beginning of a remarkable career. He had already established himself as a rising star in the world of physics, admired for his intellect and originality. However, he remained a deeply introspective individual, often wrestling with questions that extended beyond the realm of science. Even in his early years, he exhibited a profound awareness of the broader implications of scientific progress, a consciousness that would later shape his response to the development of nuclear weapons. As he prepared to return to the United States, Oppenheimer carried with him not only a wealth of scientific knowledge but also a complex and evolving worldview. His experiences in Europe had exposed him to the heights of intellectual achievement, but they had also forced him to confront his own limitations and vulnerabilities. He had developed a keen sense of the responsibilities that came with scientific discovery, a theme that would define much of his later life. Though he was still years away from the Manhattan Project, the seeds of his future dilemmas had already been sown. Upon his return to the United States, J. Robert Oppenheimer entered a period of rapid professional ascent, establishing himself as one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists of his generation. His European education, particularly his time at Göttingen under Max Born, had provided him with an exceptional foundation in quantum mechanics, and he arrived back in America as a rising star in the world of physics. Unlike many of his contemporaries who chose to work in established centers of research, Oppenheimer took an unconventional path by accepting a joint appointment at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and the University of California, Berkeley. While Caltech was already recognized as a leading institution, Berkeley was still developing its reputation as a powerhouse in physics. This dual appointment allowed him to build a research community in an environment that was not yet dominated by established figures, giving him the freedom to shape the future of American theoretical physics on his own terms. At Berkeley, Oppenheimer quickly proved to be a magnetic figure, drawing students and young physicists into his orbit. His lectures were legendary, not for their clarity but for their sheer intellectual intensity. He spoke rapidly, jumping from one concept to another with little concern for whether his audience could keep up. For those who could follow him, however, his teaching was exhilarating, a deep dive into the most profound mysteries of the universe. He demanded excellence from his students, challenging them to push the boundaries of their understanding. His mentorship would prove to be one of his greatest contributions to physics, as he trained and inspired a generation of young scientists who would go on to make significant contributions to the field. Many of his students became leaders in nuclear physics and quantum mechanics, carrying forward his intellectual legacy long after his own career had reached its tragic decline. During this time, Oppenheimer made significant contributions to quantum electrodynamics and nuclear physics. His work helped to refine the understanding of electron-positron interactions, laying the groundwork for future developments in quantum field theory. He also explored the behavior of high-energy particles, making predictions that would later be confirmed with the advent of particle accelerators. His theoretical insights extended to astrophysics as well, where he and his students studied the conditions under which massive stars collapse, an early exploration of what would later become the theory of black holes. Though Oppenheimer never focused on a single problem for too long, preferring to move from one challenge to the next, his contributions across multiple areas of physics were invaluable. His ability to synthesize different ideas and spot connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena set him apart from many of his contemporaries. While his scientific work continued to flourish, Oppenheimer also became increasingly engaged in political and philosophical discussions. The 1930s were a time of economic turmoil and political radicalization, and many intellectuals, including scientists, found themselves drawn to leftist ideologies. The Great Depression had exposed deep inequalities in American society, and the rise of fascism in Europe, particularly in Nazi Germany, made the fight against authoritarianism seem urgent. Oppenheimer, though not overtly political in his early years, was deeply affected by these events. He was especially troubled by the treatment of Jewish scientists in Germany, many of whom were being forced out of their positions under Hitler's regime. Some of his closest colleagues, including Albert Einstein and Max Born, were directly affected, and he became involved in efforts to help displaced scientists find work in the United States. At Berkeley, he found himself surrounded by left-leaning intellectuals, including many who were affiliated with the Communist Party. Though he never formally joined the party, he attended meetings, donated to leftist causes, and formed close relationships with individuals who were active in political movements. His romantic relationships during this period also drew him further into political circles. He had a deep and passionate affair with Jean Tatlock, a psychiatrist and known Communist Party member, and later married Catherine Kitty Puning, who had also been involved in leftist activism. His political associations would later come under intense scrutiny during the Red Scare of the 1950s, but at the time, his engagement with progressive causes seemed natural for a man of his intellectual background and humanitarian instincts. Even as he became more politically aware, Oppenheimer remained primarily focused on his scientific work. He was fascinated by the latest discoveries in nuclear physics, particularly the emerging understanding of nuclear fission. The realization that splitting the nucleus of an atom could release enormous amounts of energy had profound implications, both for energy production and for weaponry. He followed the work of physicists such as Enrico Fermi and Lise Meitner, who were making groundbreaking contributions to the field. Oppenheimer, along with his students and colleagues, began discussing the potential applications of nuclear fission, engaging in speculative conversations about the possibility of harnessing this power for military use. Though these discussions were largely theoretical at the time, they foreshadowed the role he would later play in leading the Manhattan Project. His growing reputation as a physicist and intellectual leader meant that he was frequently consulted on matters of scientific policy. He was invited to conferences, collaborated with leading researchers around the world, and became known not just as a brilliant scientist, but as a thinker who could bridge the gap between abstract theory and practical application. His ability to communicate complex ideas made him a valuable asset, and his work was increasingly recognized by the broader scientific community. Yet even as he rose in prominence, there were tensions brewing beneath the surface. His political associations, his sometimes abrasive personality, and his unwillingness to conform entirely to institutional expectations made him a controversial figure in certain circles. Oppenheimer's time at Berkeley was, in many ways, the peak of his intellectual freedom. He was engaged in cutting-edge research, surrounded by students who admired and challenged him, and deeply involved in the political and philosophical discussions of his time. But the world was changing rapidly, and the outbreak of World War II would soon pull him into a project that would forever alter the course of his life. The theoretical conversations about nuclear fission were about to become a matter of urgent national security, and Oppenheimer, with his unique combination of scientific brilliance and leadership ability, would find himself at the center of history's most consequential scientific endeavor. The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 marked a turning point in the history of science and warfare. German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann demonstrated that bombarding uranium atoms with neutrons caused them to split, releasing a tremendous amount of energy. This breakthrough, soon explained by Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch, suggested the possibility of an unprecedented weapon, one capable of producing destruction on an unimaginable scale. The implications were immediately clear to the scientific community, especially given the geopolitical climate of the time. Adolf Hitler's aggressive expansion in Europe and the rise of fascism placed the world on the brink of global conflict. If Nazi Germany harnessed this new discovery before the Allied powers, it could dominate the world. The fear of this prospect set off an urgent race among scientists and governments to understand and control nuclear fission before it was too late. Among those who quickly grasped the gravity of the situation were physicists Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein. Szilard, a Hungarian physicist who had long been concerned about the weaponization of nuclear energy, sought Einstein's help in drafting a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Einstein, one of the most renowned scientists of the time, carried the influence necessary to ensure that their warning would not be ignored. The letter, delivered in October 1939, urged Roosevelt to take immediate action to investigate the possibility of an atomic bomb and warned that Nazi Germany might already be working on such a project. This correspondence would ultimately lead to the formation of the Advisory Committee on Uranium, marking the first official steps toward the development of nuclear weapons. Despite the urgency of the Einstein-Szilard letter, initial efforts in the United States were slow and fragmented. The idea of an atomic bomb was still theoretical, and many scientists remained skeptical about whether it could actually be achieved. In the early days, research was scattered across different institutions with no centralized coordination. Oppenheimer, though aware of the potential of nuclear fission, was not immediately involved in these early efforts. His focus remained on theoretical physics, teaching, and mentoring students. However, as discussions about nuclear weapons intensified, he began to take a more active interest in the problem. He engaged in informal discussions with colleagues about the feasibility of a chain reaction and the mechanics of a bomb, contributing ideas that would later prove crucial. By 1941, the situation had changed dramatically. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December of that year propelled the United States into World War II, and the urgency to develop advanced weapons increased. Reports from Europe suggested that German scientists, under the direction of Werner Heisenberg, were actively pursuing nuclear research. The fear that Hitler might acquire an atomic bomb before the Allies added new pressure to the American efforts. The government moved to consolidate its nuclear research efforts under a single, coordinated initiative. This led to the creation of the Manhattan Project, a top-secret program dedicated to the development of an atomic bomb. As military and scientific leaders debated whom to appoint as the project's scientific director, Oppenheimer emerged as a surprising but ultimately decisive choice. Despite his brilliance, Oppenheimer was not the most obvious candidate for such a role. He lacked a Nobel Prize, which many saw as a mark of distinction necessary for leading a project of this magnitude. He had no prior experience managing large-scale scientific endeavors or working with the military. His political associations, particularly his past connections to leftist intellectual circles, also raised concerns. However, those who had worked with him closely recognized his unique abilities. He possessed an unparalleled grasp of theoretical physics, an ability to synthesize complex ideas across disciplines, and an infectious enthusiasm that inspired those around him. More importantly, he had an extraordinary capacity for leadership. Despite his personal eccentricities and at times aloof demeanor, he commanded the respect of his peers. His ability to bridge the gap between theoretical science and practical application made him an ideal choice for overseeing the bomb's development. In 1942, Oppenheimer was officially appointed as the scientific director of the Manhattan Project. His first major task was to establish a secure, centralized location where the world's greatest scientific minds could work in isolation, free from outside interference. After considering several sites, the government selected a remote location in the deserts of New Mexico, Los Alamos. The site was chosen for its isolation, allowing for secrecy, and for its proximity to Oppenheimer's own ranch, which he had frequented for years. He had a deep personal connection to the New Mexico landscape, finding solace in its vast, open spaces. This connection made him all the more determined to transform Los Alamos into a functional and effective research center. The establishment of Los Alamos was an enormous undertaking. Facilities had to be built from the ground up, laboratories needed to be equipped, and security measures had to be put in place to ensure that classified information remained protected. Oppenheimer, despite having no prior administrative experience, threw himself into the task with relentless energy. He worked closely with military officials, including General Leslie Groves, the project's military head. Though the two men came from vastly different backgrounds, Groves was a pragmatic, hard-nosed military engineer, while Oppenheimer was an intellectual with a poetic sensibility. They formed an effective partnership. Groves provided the organizational and logistical oversight necessary for the project's success, while Oppenheimer led the scientific efforts with visionary intensity. One of Oppenheimer's greatest achievements during this period was assembling a team of some of the most brilliant minds in physics. He personally reached out to many of the leading scientists of the era, persuading them to join the effort despite the secrecy and sacrifices it required. Among those who answered the call were Enrico Fermi, Richard Feynman, Hans Bethe, Niels Bohr, and Edward Teller. These scientists brought a diverse range of expertise from experimental physics to theoretical calculations, and together they tackled the immense technical challenges of building an atomic bomb. The collaborative atmosphere at Los Alamos was both intellectually stimulating and deeply intense. Many scientists worked around the clock, driven by the belief that they were engaged in one of the most significant scientific efforts in history. As research progressed, Oppenheimer's leadership became even more evident. He had an uncanny ability to identify problems before they arose, anticipate challenges, and guide his team toward solutions. He fostered an environment of open scientific exchange while maintaining the strict security protocols necessary for such a sensitive project. He understood the personalities and strengths of his team members, knowing when to push and when to allow intellectual freedom. Despite the immense pressures of the project, he remained deeply engaged in the scientific details, often working late into the night to review calculations and experiments. Yet, as the Manhattan Project moved closer to its goal, Oppenheimer also began to grapple with the moral implications of what he and his colleagues were creating. The theoretical discussions of nuclear fission had become a stark reality. Soon there would be a working atomic bomb, and its use would change the world forever. Though committed to the project and determined to see it through, he could not ignore the ethical questions that loomed over the endeavor. His internal conflicts would only deepen in the coming years, as the bomb neared completion and the decision of how to use it approached. By mid-1945, after years of tireless effort, the Manhattan Project was on the verge of success. The scientific and engineering challenges had been overcome, and the first full-scale test of an atomic bomb, the Trinity test, was scheduled to take place in the deserts of New Mexico. Oppenheimer stood at the center of it all, his vision and leadership having brought the project to fruition. But as he prepared to witness the birth of the atomic age, he could not have fully anticipated the profound consequences that would follow. The road to the Manhattan Project had been paved with scientific triumphs and logistical breakthroughs, but it had also led to an existential moment in human history, one that would forever alter Oppenheimer's own fate and the fate of the world. The Manhattan Project was an unprecedented scientific and military effort, bringing together the brightest minds of the time to achieve something previously thought impossible: the creation of a functional atomic bomb. The challenges were enormous, ranging from theoretical breakthroughs to engineering obstacles, from logistical nightmares to ethical dilemmas. At the heart of this effort was J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the project, who found himself navigating an extraordinary web of science, secrecy, and pressure from the highest levels of government. Every step forward in the race toward nuclear weaponry carried with it the weight of history, as those involved understood that success would change the course of war and human civilization forever. The fundamental challenge lay in translating the principles of nuclear fission into a working, deliverable weapon. Theoretical physicists had already determined that when a nucleus of uranium-235 or plutonium-239 was bombarded with neutrons, it could undergo fission, splitting apart and releasing vast amounts of energy. The difficulty was achieving a self-sustaining chain reaction, in which each fission event would produce more neutrons that could go on to split further nuclei, resulting in an explosive release of energy. This process had been demonstrated in laboratory experiments, but scaling it up to a functional bomb required overcoming significant scientific and engineering hurdles. The key lay in assembling a critical mass of fissile material quickly enough to sustain the chain reaction before the bomb tore itself apart prematurely. One of the earliest and most contentious debates within the project revolved around whether to use uranium-235 or plutonium-239 as the bomb's core. Natural uranium consists mostly of uranium-238, which does not readily undergo fission, while uranium-235, the isotope needed for a bomb, is present in only a tiny fraction of natural uranium. Separating uranium-235 from uranium-238 was an immensely difficult process, requiring advanced enrichment techniques such as gaseous diffusion and electromagnetic separation. Meanwhile, plutonium-239 could be produced artificially in nuclear reactors by bombarding uranium-238 with neutrons, offering an alternative path to an atomic weapon. However, early tests revealed that plutonium posed its own challenges, particularly due to the presence of the isotope plutonium-240, which increased the risk of premature detonation. This led to the development of two separate bomb designs. The first, known as the gun-type design, was relatively straightforward. A subcritical mass of uranium-235 would be fired at another subcritical mass, rapidly forming a critical mass and triggering an explosion. This design was ultimately used in the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The second design, known as the implosion method, was far more complex. In this approach, a subcritical core of plutonium-239 was surrounded by high explosive lenses that, when detonated, would compress the core into a supercritical state, achieving the necessary conditions for a chain reaction. This design was essential for the plutonium bomb, as the gun-type method proved unworkable for plutonium due to its higher spontaneous neutron emissions. The implosion design required extensive testing, mathematical modeling, and countless failed experiments before it was perfected. The eventual success of this method led to the creation of the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. The pressure to complete the bomb as quickly as possible came from the highest levels of the U.S. government. As World War II raged on, there was an increasing sense of urgency to ensure that the United States, rather than Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, would be the first to develop nuclear weapons. The fear of a German atomic program had initially been one of the main driving forces behind the Manhattan Project, though by 1944, intelligence reports indicated that Germany had not made significant progress. Even so, the momentum of the project continued at full speed, driven by both military necessity and the belief that this new weapon could end the war more swiftly. General Leslie Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project, was relentless in pushing for results, ensuring that every aspect of the project operated with military efficiency. He demanded secrecy, discipline, and unwavering commitment from all involved. Security was one of the highest priorities at Los Alamos and other Manhattan Project sites. Given the revolutionary nature of the work being done, there was a constant fear that enemy spies might infiltrate the project and steal nuclear secrets. The U.S. government imposed strict measures to prevent leaks, monitoring scientists' communications and limiting access to classified information on a need-to-know basis. Even among the scientists themselves, different teams were often unaware of the full scope of the project, working in isolation on specific problems without knowing how their contributions fit into the larger effort. Despite these precautions, espionage did occur. Soviet agents, embedded within the scientific community, managed to pass key information about the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union, ultimately accelerating their nuclear program after the war. Figures such as Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist working on the project, later admitted to providing crucial details to Soviet intelligence, revealing the extent of Cold War espionage even before the war had ended. For Oppenheimer, the scientific and logistical challenges of the Manhattan Project were compounded by profound ethical dilemmas. Initially, he had been driven by the intellectual challenge of the project and the urgent need to prevent Nazi Germany from acquiring nuclear weapons. However, as it became clear that Germany would not succeed in developing an atomic bomb, Oppenheimer's concerns began to shift. The weapon that he and his colleagues were building was no longer just a means of defense against a hypothetical enemy, it was now a tool that would be used against real cities, with catastrophic consequences for civilians. He understood that once the bomb was completed, its use would be a political and military decision, not a scientific one. Yet he could not ignore the moral weight of his contributions. As the bomb neared completion, discussions about its potential use intensified. Some scientists at Los Alamos argued that the bomb should not be used against populated cities but rather demonstrated in an uninhabited area to force Japan's surrender. Others believed that its use was necessary to bring the war to a swift end, potentially saving millions of lives that would be lost in a prolonged conflict. The Japanese government had shown little inclination to surrender despite the devastation of conventional bombings, and military leaders feared that an invasion of Japan would result in enormous casualties on both sides. The bomb, they believed, could force Japan to capitulate without the need for a costly land invasion. Oppenheimer himself, despite his growing unease, ultimately supported the decision to use the bomb. He saw it as a means to end the war quickly and prevent even greater suffering. Yet he was not blind to the horrors that would follow. He understood that the power being unleashed was unlike anything the world had ever seen before, and that once the atomic age had begun, there would be no turning back. The knowledge that he had helped create a weapon of such immense destructive capability weighed heavily on him, foreshadowing the deep moral crisis he would face in the years to come. In July 1945, the moment of truth arrived. The first full-scale test of an atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity, was scheduled to take place in the New Mexico desert. As the countdown began in the early morning hours, Oppenheimer stood among his colleagues, waiting to witness the culmination of years of effort, sacrifice, and ethical torment. When the bomb detonated, the desert was momentarily transformed into daylight, an immense fireball rising into the sky, followed by a towering mushroom cloud. The force of the explosion exceeded expectations, sending a shockwave across the desert and shaking the very ground beneath them. Scientists, soldiers, and engineers watched in awe, realizing that they had changed the world forever. Oppenheimer's reaction to the test would become legendary. As he later recalled, a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, came to his mind, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In that moment he understood the full weight of what had been accomplished. The scientific challenge had been conquered, but at a cost that could not yet be fully measured. The test had proven that the atomic bomb was real, and now it would be used, marking the dawn of a new and terrifying era. The final preparations for the Trinity test were carried out under intense secrecy and meticulous planning. By the summer of 1945, after years of research, development, and countless obstacles, the Manhattan Project had reached its defining moment. Scientists, engineers, and military officials had spent months assembling the components of the bomb, testing every detail to ensure that the device would function as expected. The chosen test site was a remote stretch of desert in New Mexico known as the Jornada del Muerto, a name that ominously translated to Journey of the Dead Man. This barren, desolate landscape would serve as the proving ground for the most powerful weapon ever devised by humankind. Oppenheimer, as the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, bore much of the weight of responsibility. His excitement was tempered by anxiety, as the entire endeavor rested on a fragile combination of theory and engineering. The calculations had been done, the physics had been worked out, and smaller-scale tests had indicated that the device should function. However, this was the moment of truth, when theory would be put into practice in the most consequential way possible. If the test failed, years of work, billions of dollars, and the credibility of nuclear physics itself would be called into question. If it succeeded, a new era of warfare would begin, one that could redefine human existence. In the days leading up to the test, the final components of the bomb, nicknamed the gadget, were transported to the test site under heavy security. Scientists and technicians carefully assembled the plutonium core and the complex network of explosive lenses that would trigger the implosion necessary to reach critical mass. The bomb was then hoisted onto a 100-foot steel tower to simulate an aerial detonation, ensuring that the blast could be properly observed and analyzed. Around the site, bunkers and observation posts were set up, where scientists and military personnel would monitor the test from a safe distance. As the scheduled test date approached, the unpredictability of the desert weather added to the tension. A storm rolled in on the night of July 15, threatening to delay the detonation. Oppenheimer, along with General Leslie Groves and other key figures, debated whether to proceed or wait for better conditions. Any delay risked political complications, as the bomb needed to be tested before a decision could be made about its use in the ongoing war against Japan. Eventually, the storm began to clear, and it was decided that the test would go forward in the early hours of July 16, 1945. In the final moments before detonation, those present at the site took their positions in reinforced observation bunkers. Some lay flat on the ground, others donned welder's goggles to shield their eyes from the anticipated brilliance of the explosion. Oppenheimer, standing among his colleagues, was gripped by an intense mix of emotions. This was the culmination of years of effort, a moment that would determine not just the success of the Manhattan Project but the course of future global conflicts. At precisely 5:29 a.m., the countdown reached zero. A blinding flash erupted from the tower, turning night into day across the desert. A massive fireball expanded outward, its colors shifting from white-hot intensity to deep oranges and reds as it consumed everything in its immediate vicinity. The shockwave followed seconds later, an immense force that rattled the ground and sent a deafening roar across the landscape. The mushroom cloud, now synonymous with nuclear explosions, rose high into the sky, reaching over 7 miles in height. Observers, even those positioned miles away, felt the searing heat on their faces. The reactions among those present varied from awe to horror. Many of the scientists, despite having worked toward this moment, were unprepared for the sheer magnitude of the explosion. Some cheered, seeing the test as a triumphant validation of their scientific expertise and dedication. Others remained silent, absorbing the implications of what they had just witnessed. General Groves and other military officials were visibly pleased. The bomb had worked, and with it came an unparalleled strategic advantage. Yet for some, including Oppenheimer, the moment was deeply unsettling. In later years, Oppenheimer would famously recall that as he watched the explosion, a passage from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, came to his mind, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This was not a moment of unbridled celebration for him, but rather one of profound realization. The power that had been unleashed was unlike anything humanity had ever known. It was not merely a new weapon, it was a force that could bring about the end of civilization if wielded recklessly. The immediate political implications of the test were clear. The successful detonation of the Trinity bomb meant that the United States now possessed a weapon of unprecedented destructive capability. Even before the test, discussions had already begun on how and when to use it against Japan. President Harry Truman, attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, received news of the successful test and was now faced with a fateful decision. The war in the Pacific was still raging, and American military planners estimated that an invasion of Japan would result in hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. The bomb, they believed, could force Japan into surrender and bring the war to a swift conclusion. The test also signaled the beginning of a new geopolitical reality. The Soviet Union, though still an ally at the time, was already being eyed with suspicion by American policymakers. The successful detonation of the bomb gave the United States a significant advantage in post-war negotiations, setting the stage for the Cold War arms race. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, upon hearing of the test, immediately accelerated his own country's efforts to develop nuclear weapons, leading to a nuclear arms race that would define much of the 20th century. For Oppenheimer, the moment was deeply personal as well as historical. He had led the scientific effort to create the bomb, but now he faced the reality of what had been accomplished. In the days following the test, he was both praised and burdened by the weight of his role. He understood that this was only the beginning. The use of the bomb in warfare was now inevitable, and once the atomic age had begun, there would be no turning back. The power to destroy entire cities, to annihilate populations, to reshape the world order, this was now a reality. Back at Los Alamos, scientists and officials reviewed the data collected from the test. The bomb had exceeded expectations in terms of yield, producing an explosion equivalent to around 20 kilotons of TNT. The heat from the explosion had melted the desert sand into a new kind of glass, later named Trinitite, a physical testament to the power of the detonation. Radiation levels in the area were dangerously high, and the long-term effects of nuclear fallout were still not fully understood. Despite these unknowns, the project had achieved its goal. The bomb was ready. As the days passed, Oppenheimer's reflections on the test grew heavier. He had once been eager to see the bomb built, to prove that the science worked. Now that it had succeeded, he found himself grappling with the full consequences of that success. The knowledge that he had helped create a weapon of such unimaginable destruction was not easily reconciled. He had believed that the bomb would be necessary to end the war, but what would follow? Would this technology be controlled, or would it lead to an endless cycle of escalation and destruction? The Trinity test marked a turning point not just for the war but for the world. It was the moment that humanity entered the nuclear age, an age defined by both extraordinary scientific achievement and existential danger. In the coming weeks, the bomb would be used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, demonstrating its devastating power to the world. Oppenheimer, once at the center of the project, would soon find himself questioning his role, his legacy, and the fate of a world now living under the shadow of nuclear weapons. The explosion in the New Mexico desert had been more than just a scientific triumph. It was a moment of irreversible change. The world could never go back to what it was before that dawn in July 1945. The genie had been let out of the bottle, and Oppenheimer, more than most, understood that there was no way to put it back. The morning of August 6, 1945, dawned like any other in Hiroshima, Japan. Citizens went about their daily routines, unaware that their city was about to become the first target of a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. At 8:15 a.m., the American B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped a single bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, over the city. Within seconds, a blinding flash consumed everything in its vicinity. The explosion generated temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun, instantly incinerating tens of thousands of people. The shockwave leveled buildings for miles, and a massive mushroom cloud rose over the ruins. Fires erupted across the city, burning survivors who had escaped the initial blast. The devastation was unimaginable. News of the bombing quickly spread among American military and government officials, and among the scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer, who had dedicated years to ensuring the bomb's success, received the report with a mixture of emotions. On one hand, the bomb had worked exactly as designed. The scientific and engineering challenges had been conquered, proving the power of nuclear fission. On the other hand, he now fully understood the human cost of that success. Hiroshima was not a barren test site in the New Mexico desert. It was a city filled with men, women, and children who had just been obliterated in an instant. 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Although Nagasaki had not been the primary target that day, circumstances led to its destruction. This bomb was different from the first, using a plutonium-based design rather than uranium, but its effects were just as devastating. The explosion flattened much of the city, killing tens of thousands instantly and leaving many others to suffer slow, agonizing deaths from burns and radiation poisoning. By August 15, Japan had surrendered, effectively ending World War II. The bombings had achieved their military objective, forcing Japan's leadership to accept defeat without an invasion that could have cost millions of lives. Yet even as the world celebrated the war's end, the moral and ethical implications of the bombings weighed heavily on those who had been responsible for creating the weapon. Oppenheimer, more than most, felt the full gravity of what had happened. He had spent years immersed in the theoretical and technical aspects of building the bomb, but now he had to confront the reality of what it had done. Was this truly victory, or had humanity crossed a line from which it could never return? In the immediate aftermath, Oppenheimer found himself grappling with a profound internal conflict. He had justified the bomb's development on the grounds that it was necessary to defeat Nazi Germany, but Germany had surrendered before the bomb was ready. Its use against Japan had been driven by strategic and political considerations rather than the existential threat that had originally motivated the project. The images and reports coming out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki horrified him. Burned bodies, shadow imprints of people who had been vaporized, survivors wandering through ruins in shock. This was the true cost of the atomic bomb. The scientific triumph felt hollow in the face of such destruction. His discomfort with the bombings soon became clear in his interactions with American leadership. In October 1945, he met with President Harry Truman at the White House. The meeting was meant to discuss the future of nuclear weapons, but it quickly turned into a moment of personal crisis for Oppenheimer. During the conversation, he made a statement that would become infamous. "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, who saw the bombings as a justified means of ending the war, was furious. He later described Oppenheimer as a crybaby scientist, and made it clear he wanted nothing more to do with him. To Truman and other political leaders, the bomb was simply another weapon, an extraordinary one but a necessary tool of war. To Oppenheimer it was something far more profound and terrible. Publicly, the reaction to the bombings was complex. In the United States, the general sentiment was one of relief and triumph. The war had ended, and American soldiers would not have to fight a bloody invasion of Japan. Many Americans viewed the bomb as a necessary evil, justified by the alternative of prolonged warfare. However, as more details emerged about the aftermath, the radiation sickness, the lingering suffering of survivors, and the total annihilation of entire cities, some began to question whether such a weapon should ever be used again. Internationally, the reaction was even more varied. Allied nations recognized the strategic implications. The United States now possessed a weapon of unparalleled power. The Soviet Union, already wary of American intentions, immediately intensified its efforts to develop its own atomic bomb, leading to the nuclear arms race that would define the Cold War. Meanwhile, the people of Japan struggled to comprehend the devastation that had befallen them. Survivors, known as hibakusha, would live with the consequences of radiation exposure for the rest of their lives, and the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would become lasting symbols of nuclear destruction. Oppenheimer, despite his growing unease, remained at the center of nuclear policy discussions in the early post-war years. He became an advocate for arms control, believing that nuclear weapons should not be used as instruments of unchecked military power. He supported the idea of international oversight of atomic energy, hoping that the bomb would never again be used in war. However, this position put him at odds with political and military leaders who saw nuclear weapons as essential to American dominance on the world stage. As time passed, Oppenheimer's regret deepened. He could not ignore the reality that he had helped usher in a terrifying new age. He had once believed that the bomb might bring peace, that its sheer destructive force would make future wars unthinkable. But now he saw that rather than preventing conflict, nuclear weapons had become a permanent fixture of global politics. The United States and the Soviet Union were now locked in a race to build even more powerful bombs, each side fearing that the other would strike first. The threat of total annihilation loomed over the world, and Oppenheimer knew that he had played a crucial role in creating that reality. In reflecting on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he returned to the words of the Bhagavad Gita, which had haunted him since the Trinity test. He had become death, the destroyer of worlds. This was not just a poetic expression. It was a recognition that the knowledge he had helped unlock could never be undone. The bombings had proven what nuclear weapons were capable of, and there was no turning back. Yet, even as he struggled with guilt and doubt, Oppenheimer did not completely reject his past work. He knew that if he had not led the Manhattan Project, someone else would have. The bomb was an inevitability, born from the discoveries of modern physics and the demands of war. His personal torment was not about whether the bomb should have been built, but about what it meant for the future of humanity. Could the world survive in an age where such weapons existed? Would reason and diplomacy prevail, or would nuclear war eventually destroy civilization? These questions would define the rest of his life. He had been at the forefront of scientific progress, only to see that progress turned into a tool of mass destruction. He had been celebrated as a genius and a patriot, only to become a controversial figure whose moral stance on nuclear weapons made him a target of political scrutiny. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just historical events, they were a turning point for Oppenheimer, for the United States, and for the world. The nuclear age had begun, and it was clear that its consequences would be felt for generations. The moment of reckoning had arrived, not just for Oppenheimer but for all of humanity. Oppenheimer's journey from being one of America's most celebrated scientists to a man stripped of his security clearance and publicly humiliated was as dramatic as the events leading up to it. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he had become a public intellectual, advocating for the responsible use of nuclear energy and cautioning against an unchecked arms race. However, as the Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated, the political climate in America shifted drastically. Those who had once been regarded as brilliant thinkers were now viewed with suspicion, especially if they had even the slightest association with leftist ideologies. Oppenheimer, with his history of associations with communist-affiliated individuals and his outspoken opposition to the development of the hydrogen bomb, found himself at the center of a political storm that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The hydrogen bomb, or thermonuclear weapon, was a subject of great controversy within the scientific community. Unlike the atomic bomb, which relied on nuclear fission, the hydrogen bomb utilized nuclear fusion, making it exponentially more powerful. Edward Teller, one of Oppenheimer's former colleagues and a key figure in American nuclear development, was one of the most vocal advocates for its creation. Teller and others believed that in the face of the growing Soviet threat, the United States needed to pursue the hydrogen bomb to maintain its strategic superiority. Oppenheimer, however, strongly disagreed. He believed that nuclear weapons had already reached a level of destruction that made further advancements not only unnecessary but dangerous. He argued that the hydrogen bomb was not a weapon of war, but one of pure genocide. His moral opposition, combined with his influence over nuclear policy, made him an obstacle to those pushing for its rapid development. This opposition placed him at odds with powerful figures in the U.S. military and government. His reluctance to support the hydrogen bomb project was perceived by some as an act of disloyalty. The political landscape of the early 1950s, dominated by the fear of communism and Soviet espionage, did not favor those who expressed dissenting views on national security. Oppenheimer had long been known for his associations with leftist intellectuals, and during the McCarthy era, a time when accusations of communist sympathies could end careers, these past connections became a serious liability. The scrutiny of Oppenheimer intensified as the American government, driven by the paranoia of the Red Scare, sought to identify and eliminate any perceived threats within its ranks. The FBI had been monitoring Oppenheimer for years due to his earlier ties to communist organizations and individuals, including his wife, Kitty, and his brother, Frank, both of whom had been members of the Communist Party. Though there was never any concrete evidence that Oppenheimer himself had been an active member or had engaged in espionage, the mere suggestion of communist ties was enough to cast doubt on his loyalty. His increasing opposition to nuclear escalation made him an even easier target for those who wanted to discredit him. In 1954, Oppenheimer was subjected to a brutal security hearing conducted by the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC. The hearing was ostensibly meant to assess whether he posed a security risk, but in reality, it was a politically motivated attack designed to remove him from any position of influence. The proceedings were heavily biased against him from the start. He was accused of obstructing the hydrogen bomb project, being sympathetic to communist causes, and associating with individuals who were deemed security risks. The hearing was not a fair trial but a calculated effort to discredit him. The hearings were deeply humiliating for Oppenheimer. He was subjected to relentless questioning, forced to defend his past associations, and accused of being untrustworthy. Former colleagues were called to testify, and while some spoke in his defense, others, most notably Edward Teller, either distanced themselves from him or outright condemned him. Teller's testimony was particularly damaging. While he did not explicitly state that Oppenheimer was a traitor, he expressed doubts about Oppenheimer's commitment to national security, effectively sealing his fate. The betrayal by someone he had once worked alongside was a bitter blow. At the conclusion of the hearings, Oppenheimer was stripped of his security clearance. The decision effectively ended his role in shaping American nuclear policy. The man who had led the Manhattan Project, who had once been at the forefront of American scientific achievement, was now cast out of the very world he had helped create. The ruling was a devastating personal and professional defeat. Though he was not imprisoned or formally charged with any crimes, the damage to his reputation was irreversible. In the aftermath of the hearings, Oppenheimer withdrew from public life. He continued to work as a physicist and an academic, but his influence over national policy was gone. He took a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he focused on theoretical physics and philosophy, but the days of being at the center of scientific and political discussions on nuclear weapons were over. Though he retained the support of many in the scientific community, he was no longer a figure of power in Washington. Despite his fall from grace, Oppenheimer's legacy endured. Many viewed his treatment as unjust and a reflection of the political hysteria of the time rather than a genuine assessment of his character or actions. Over the years, as the paranoia of the McCarthy era faded, his reputation began to recover. By the 1960s, there was growing recognition that his opposition to the hydrogen bomb had been rooted in genuine ethical concerns rather than disloyalty. In 1963 he was awarded the Enrico Fermi Award by President Lyndon B. Johnson, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged his contributions to science and attempted to rehabilitate his image. However, the scars of his public humiliation never fully healed. Oppenheimer's story is a tragic one, not because he was guilty of any crime, but because he became a victim of political forces beyond his control. He had dedicated his life to science, only to see that science turned into a weapon of unimaginable destruction. He had served his country, only to be cast aside when his views no longer aligned with the prevailing political agenda. His fall from grace was not the result of betrayal on his part, but of a system that had no room for dissent, even from those who had once been its greatest assets. Looking back, his opposition to the hydrogen bomb seems prescient. The arms race that followed his downfall led to the stockpiling of thousands of nuclear weapons, creating a world where the threat of total annihilation became a permanent reality. The very concerns he had voiced, the dangers of unchecked nuclear proliferation and the moral responsibility of scientists, became even more relevant in the decades that followed. Though he did not live to see the full consequences of the nuclear arms race, his warnings about the dangers of these weapons continue to resonate. The tragedy of Oppenheimer's downfall lies not just in the personal cost he bore, but in what it revealed about the intersection of science, politics, and power. He was a man who had changed the course of history, yet he was discarded when his views no longer served the interests of those in control. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the price of scientific discovery, the dangers of political persecution, and the complex relationship between those who create powerful technologies and those who seek to wield them. After the devastating security hearings of 1954, Robert Oppenheimer found himself removed from the corridors of power and national decision-making. Once at the forefront of American scientific and military strategy, he was now a man exiled from the very world he had helped shape. He did not return to Los Alamos or any other government role related to nuclear policy. Instead, he withdrew into the world of academia, retreating to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he had already been serving as director since 1947. Though publicly disgraced, he remained deeply engaged with theoretical physics, philosophy, and the broader implications of scientific progress. Oppenheimer's exile from government did not mean complete isolation. He continued to write and lecture, grappling with the ethical consequences of nuclear warfare and the responsibilities of scientists in society. His interest in philosophy, cultivated since his youth, became more pronounced in these later years. He explored themes of duty, morality, and the relationship between knowledge and power. His reflections often drew from Eastern philosophy, particularly the Bhagavad Gita, which had profoundly influenced him throughout his life. The passage he had famously quoted during the Trinity test, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," was not merely a dramatic statement, but a reflection of his deep engagement with the moral weight of his actions. Despite his retreat from government affairs, Oppenheimer remained a significant intellectual figure, and his views on science and policy were still sought after. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, he gave lectures on the nature of scientific discovery, the limits of human knowledge, and the dangers of technological advancements without ethical oversight. His eloquence and depth of thought ensured that he remained respected within scientific and academic communities, even if he was no longer trusted by political leaders. His perspective on nuclear arms was not that of a pacifist. He never regretted his role in the Manhattan Project, but rather that of a man who believed in limits and responsibility. He did not oppose national defense, but he opposed reckless escalation and the notion that nuclear weapons could be used as tools of diplomacy or intimidation. His partial redemption came in 1963 when President Lyndon B. Johnson awarded him the Enrico Fermi Award, one of the highest honors in American science. This award, given by the Atomic Energy Commission, the same institution that had stripped him of his security clearance a decade earlier, was a significant gesture, acknowledging his contributions to physics and his role in advancing American scientific research. The award did not erase the humiliation of 1954, but it was an official recognition that his treatment had been unjust. Oppenheimer accepted the honor with grace, though by this time he was already suffering from declining health. His later years were marked by increasing introspection. The fast-paced world of war, politics, and clandestine research had been replaced by quieter pursuits, though the specter of nuclear war still loomed large. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union had reached alarming heights, and the very weapons he had helped create were now being produced in even more destructive forms. Oppenheimer saw the dangers of unchecked technological progress and worried that science, without ethical considerations, could lead humanity to ruin. He spoke often about the need for wisdom in governance and restraint in warfare, but he was aware that his influence was limited. The world had moved on, and he was now a man speaking from the sidelines rather than from within the halls of power. Physically, the years of stress, smoking, and mental burden began to take their toll. In 1965, he was diagnosed with throat cancer, a consequence of a lifetime of heavy smoking. The diagnosis was grim, and though he underwent treatments, the disease progressed rapidly. His final years were spent in quiet contemplation at his home in Princeton, surrounded by family and close friends. The man who had once been at the center of world-changing events now faced his mortality with a level of acceptance that reflected his philosophical outlook. He did not rail against his fate but instead seemed to approach it with the same detached, intellectual curiosity that had defined his life. He died on February 18, 1967, at the age of 62. Oppenheimer's legacy remains one of complexity. To some, he is a hero, a brilliant scientist whose work helped end World War II and usher in an era of technological advancement. To others, he is a tragic figure, a man who created the ultimate weapon only to be cast aside by the very government he served. And to others still, he is a cautionary tale, a scientist whose genius enabled mass destruction, raising ethical questions that humanity continues to grapple with today. His story is one of paradoxes. He was a man of deep intellect and broad cultural interests, yet he found himself entangled in the brutal realities of war and power. He was a scientist dedicated to discovery, but his greatest achievement was a weapon of unprecedented destruction. He was a patriot, yet he was treated as a traitor. His life reflects the tension between knowledge and responsibility, between scientific progress and its moral consequences. Today, Oppenheimer is remembered not just as a physicist, but as a symbol of the ethical dilemmas that come with scientific discovery. His name is often invoked in discussions of nuclear policy, artificial intelligence, and other transformative technologies that hold both great promise and great peril. His words, particularly his haunting invocation of the Bhagavad Gita, continue to resonate in a world where the threat of nuclear war has never fully disappeared. The debate over his legacy is unlikely to ever be fully settled. Some view him as a martyr of Cold War paranoia, unfairly persecuted for his political views. Others see him as a man who, despite his later regrets, could not escape the consequences of his own actions. What remains undeniable is his impact on history. The Manhattan Project changed the world, and Oppenheimer was at its center. His life and career serve as a reminder that scientific discovery is never purely theoretical. It always exists within the broader context of human society, politics, and ethics. Even decades after his death, Oppenheimer's story continues to inspire books, films, and academic discussions. The ethical questions he wrestled with are more relevant than ever, as humanity faces new technological frontiers that could alter the course of civilization. His legacy is not just one of scientific achievement but of philosophical inquiry, moral reckoning, and the enduring struggle to balance knowledge with wisdom. The development of nuclear weapons remains one of the most profound moral dilemmas in human history. The creation of the atomic bomb was not merely a scientific achievement but a moment that redefined warfare, power, and human ethics. At the center of this transformation stood J. Robert Oppenheimer, a man whose own moral struggles reflected the larger tensions surrounding nuclear technology. His role as the leader of the Manhattan Project ensured his place in history, but his internal conflicts about the consequences of his work make him an enduringly complex figure. The ethical questions he grappled with remain relevant, as the specter of nuclear war continues to loom over the world. From the very beginning, the atomic bomb was developed in the context of war. The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 made it clear that an incredibly powerful weapon could be built, and the fear that Nazi Germany might succeed in developing it first drove the United States to accelerate its efforts. This urgency overshadowed many ethical concerns in the early days of nuclear research. The scientists involved, including Oppenheimer, believed that their work was necessary to prevent an even greater catastrophe. If the Allies did not build the bomb first, Hitler might. This rationale made the Manhattan Project seem not only justified but imperative. However, the situation changed once Germany was defeated in May 1945. With the primary enemy out of the picture, the justification for using the bomb became less clear. Japan was still at war with the United States, but it was weakened and on the brink of collapse. Many scientists, including some who had worked on the Manhattan Project, questioned whether the bomb was necessary to end the war. Oppenheimer, despite his scientific leadership, found himself in the middle of these ethical debates. He had dedicated years to making the bomb a reality, but as its use became imminent, he began to struggle with the moral weight of what he had helped create. The Trinity test on July 16, 1945, was a moment of both triumph and horror. The bomb worked, proving that nuclear energy could be harnessed for unprecedented destruction. The scientists at Los Alamos had succeeded, but their reactions were not uniform. Some celebrated, believing they had secured victory for the United States. Others, including Oppenheimer, were deeply unsettled. He famously recalled a passage from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This was not the reaction of a man who saw the bomb purely as a scientific accomplishment. It was the response of someone who understood its devastating potential. In that moment, he seemed to recognize that the bomb was more than a weapon. It was a turning point in human history. When the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Oppenheimer's moral struggle intensified. The sheer scale of destruction, the loss of civilian life, and the long-term consequences of radiation exposure raised deep ethical concerns. Though the bombings forced Japan's surrender and ended World War II, they also introduced the world to the horrors of nuclear warfare. Oppenheimer initially expressed pride in the Manhattan Project's success, but his views soon shifted. In a meeting with President Truman, he remarked that he felt as though he had blood on his hands. Truman was reportedly furious, dismissing Oppenheimer as a crybaby scientist. This moment signified the growing rift between Oppenheimer's moral concerns and the political realities of nuclear power. After the war, Oppenheimer became a vocal advocate for arms control. He opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb, a weapon even more destructive than the atomic bombs used in Japan. His opposition put him at odds with powerful figures in the U.S. government, including Edward Teller and military officials who believed that America needed to maintain nuclear superiority. Oppenheimer's concerns were not just about the immediate effects of nuclear weapons but about their long-term consequences. He feared an escalating arms race, where nations would continue building more powerful bombs with no end in sight. His warnings proved prophetic as the Cold War saw both the United States and the Soviet Union amass vast nuclear arsenals, leading to a state of perpetual fear and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. The ethical dilemmas Oppenheimer faced are still relevant to modern scientists. His life serves as a cautionary tale about the responsibilities that come with scientific discovery. Today, advancements in artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and other transformative technologies raise similar questions. Just because something can be created, does that mean it should be? How can scientists ensure that their work benefits humanity rather than leading to unintended destruction? Oppenheimer's story highlights the need for ethical considerations in scientific research. He was a man who believed in the pursuit of knowledge but also recognized the dangers of using that knowledge without restraint. His legacy is deeply complicated. Some view him as a hero of science, a visionary who led one of the most ambitious research projects in history. Others see him as a tragic figure, a man who helped unleash nuclear weapons but was later cast aside when he tried to advocate for caution. Still others regard him as a warning, a reminder of the dangers that arise when scientists become too entangled with political and military forces. His life encapsulates the dual nature of scientific progress, the ability to create and to destroy. Even decades after his death, Oppenheimer remains a subject of debate. The world he helped shape is still grappling with nuclear weapons, with nations continuing to expand their arsenals. The ethical questions he wrestled with have not disappeared, and his story continues to resonate. He is remembered not just as a scientist, but as a thinker who understood the profound moral weight of his work. His journey from ambitious physicist to conflicted philosopher reflects the broader struggles of humanity as it navigates the consequences of its own technological advancements. Ultimately, Oppenheimer's life serves as both an inspiration and a warning. He exemplifies the brilliance and curiosity that drive scientific discovery, but he also embodies the moral struggles that come with great power. His legacy challenges modern scientists, policymakers, and citizens to consider the ethical dimensions of progress. In a world still shaped by the nuclear age, his story remains as relevant as ever. J. Robert Oppenheimer's legacy is one of profound complexity, shaped by his pivotal role in the development of nuclear weapons and his later moral struggles with their consequences. He was both a brilliant scientist and a man deeply conflicted about the implications of his work. His contributions to theoretical physics and his leadership in the Manhattan Project solidified his place in history, yet his later years were marked by regret, controversy, and a search for redemption. His story is not just one of scientific achievement but also of ethical dilemmas, political intrigue, and the burden of knowledge that comes with wielding great power. The atomic bomb forever altered human history, and Oppenheimer was at the center of that transformation. His scientific expertise, leadership, and ability to bring together the brightest minds in physics made the Manhattan Project a success. Without his influence, the project may not have achieved its goal as swiftly as it did. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended World War II, but they also introduced a new era of existential threat, one where humanity had the means to destroy itself. Oppenheimer's famous quote from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," reflects the weight of that realization. He had helped create a weapon of unimaginable destruction, and its use left him with a moral burden that he would carry for the rest of his life. The impact of Oppenheimer's work extends far beyond the Manhattan Project. His role in shaping nuclear policy and his warnings about the dangers of an arms race remain relevant even today. After the war, he became a leading voice against the development of the hydrogen bomb, arguing that the pursuit of ever more destructive weapons was reckless and dangerous. His concerns about the unchecked proliferation of nuclear arms proved prophetic, as the Cold War saw the United States and the Soviet Union build vast arsenals capable of global annihilation. The nuclear arms race defined international politics for decades, and the threat of nuclear conflict continues to shape global security strategies. Oppenheimer's efforts to promote arms control and responsible scientific ethics, while ultimately unsuccessful in his time, set a precedent for later efforts toward nuclear disarmament. His fall from grace during the Red Scare further complicates his legacy. Once celebrated as the father of the atomic bomb, he was later vilified and stripped of his security clearance in 1954 due to suspicions about his political affiliations and opposition to certain military policies. The security hearings humiliated him, effectively ending his influence in government nuclear policy. Though he had never been a communist, his past associations with leftist intellectuals and his advocacy for arms control made him a target during an era of heightened paranoia. His treatment during the hearings was seen by many as a betrayal, a stark reminder of how political tides can shift against even the most celebrated figures. It was only in 1963, when he was awarded the Enrico Fermi Award, that the U.S. government offered a form of redemption, though the scars of the hearings never fully faded. Despite the controversies surrounding him, Oppenheimer's intellectual contributions to physics were undeniable. His work in quantum mechanics, quantum electrodynamics, and astrophysics influenced generations of scientists. As a teacher, he mentored some of the brightest minds in physics, ensuring that his impact would extend beyond his own research. Even after his fall from political grace, he continued to engage in academic pursuits, reflecting on the philosophical implications of science and its role in shaping the modern world. His later years were marked by contemplation rather than action, as he sought to come to terms with his own legacy. The broader significance of Oppenheimer's life lies in the ethical questions it raises. He embodied the dilemma that scientists often face when their discoveries have the potential for both progress and destruction. His story is a reminder that knowledge, once unlocked, cannot be contained. Scientific advancements can be used for great good, but they also carry the risk of unintended consequences. The atomic bomb, once developed, led to an era of nuclear brinkmanship that still threatens global stability. Oppenheimer understood this reality all too well, and his later years were defined by his attempts to reconcile his role in unleashing such power. Today, as new scientific and technological breakthroughs emerge, the lessons of Oppenheimer's life remain relevant. From artificial intelligence to genetic engineering, humanity continues to develop tools that could reshape the world in ways both beneficial and dangerous. The responsibility of scientists to consider the ethical implications of their work is greater than ever. Oppenheimer's legacy serves as a cautionary tale, urging future generations to think carefully about the consequences of their discoveries and to advocate for ethical oversight in the pursuit of knowledge. His death in 1967 marked the end of a remarkable life, but his influence endures. Whether viewed as a tragic figure, a scientific hero, or a cautionary example, Oppenheimer's story continues to captivate historians, scientists, and philosophers alike. He was a man who stood at the crossroads of science and morality, power and responsibility, creation and destruction. His name is forever linked to the dawn of the nuclear age, an era that humanity is still grappling with today. Ultimately, Oppenheimer's legacy is one of duality. He was both a creator and a destroyer, a man of immense intellect and deep inner turmoil. His contributions to physics and his leadership in the Manhattan Project changed the world, but his later years revealed the heavy cost of such power. The burden of knowledge, once shouldered, cannot be cast aside. His life serves as a reminder that scientific progress must always be tempered with ethical consideration, and that those who wield great power must also bear great responsibility.